Welcome to Libyth. The mountains were there before Japan existed. They will be there after. This observation sounds simple, even obvious, and in one sense it is a geological fact, uncontroversial, available to anyone who knows the rough timescales of mountain formation and political history. But in the context of Oku no Hosomichi, it is the axis on which the entire text turns, the gravitational fact around which every landscape, every haiku, every invocation of historical ruin and human ambition organizes itself. Because if the mountains were there before Japan existed and will be there after, then Japan, meaning the civilization, the social order, the shogunate and its elaborate machinery of control, the poetic tradition and its accumulated weight of utamakura and literary association, the self that walks through all of this composing 17 syllables at a time, is a temporary condition of the mountains, not the other way around. The text knows this, and everything it does formally is shaped by the knowing. The relationship between the human and the natural in Basho's Japan was structured by a sensibility that we might loosely associate with Shinto, though Shinto in the 17th century was not yet the codified national religion it would become in the Meiji period. It was something more diffuse and more present, a way of inhabiting a landscape, of taking seriously the spiritual dimension of natural things, of recognizing that rivers and mountains and ancient trees and particular rocks are not simply physical objects, but presences, entities with their own mode of being, their own interior reality, their own relationship to the sacred that exists independently of human recognition or human use. The kami, the spirits or divine forces that inhabit natural things in the Shinto understanding, are not supernatural additions to the world, projections of human spirituality onto inert matter. They are the world's own spirituality, the sacred quality that natural things actually have, that human consciousness can recognize when it approaches with the appropriate quality of attention. Basho has this quality of attention, and the text demonstrates it in every encounter with a natural landscape of significance. The demonstration is never labored, never explained, never dressed up in theological language. It is simply present in the precision of the perception, in the selection of the detail that the haiku crystallizes, in the quality of stillness that the prose creates before the haiku arrives. When Basho enters a landscape of particular power, the mountains of the interior, the Japan sea coast, the boulder-strewn approaches to a mountain temple, the prose registers something that is more than aesthetic appreciation. It registers an encounter with something that was not put there for him and does not require his presence to be what it is, something that exists in its own right and demands the response of genuine attention rather than the response of use or appreciation or the cataloging of the tourist. The mountain temple of Yamadera, the Ryushakuji, is the most precise example of this in the text. The temple is built into the face of a mountain in the Yamagata region, its buildings distributed across the steep, rocky face of the cliff at various elevations, reached by climbing hundreds of stone steps cut into the rock. The approach is difficult. The climb takes effort. And what it delivers is a quality of stillness that Basho describes in the prose as entering the mind, as settling the accumulated noise of the journey, as something physical, a stillness that is not the absence of sensation, but a positive presence, a quality of the place itself that presses against the consciousness that enters it. Then the cicadas begin. The haiku, Shizukasa /Iwanai Shimiru Semi no Ko. Stillness, the voice of the cicadas penetrating the rock. This haiku is frequently cited as a paradox. How can the cry of insects make stillness? And the paradox is real, but it is not a puzzle. It is a description of something that anyone who has sat in deep quiet and heard a single sound against that quiet will recognize. The sound does not break the stillness but deepens it, because the stillness was already there as the ground against which the sound becomes audible. And the sound reveals the ground the way a splash reveals the surface of water. The cicadas and the rock are in relationship. The sound entering the stone receiving the sound, neither transformed by the encounter, and yet the encounter itself producing something that neither element alone contains. This is the kami of the mountain temple, not a supernatural entity inhabiting the rock, but the quality of being that the rock and the sound and the stillness together produce in the consciousness present to them. Matsushima stands at the other pole of the text's engagement with natural beauty, and it offers something so extreme that the text's response to it is formally unprecedented. Matsushima has been called the most beautiful landscape in Japan since at least the Heian period of the 9th and 10th centuries, and the literary anticipation surrounding Basho's arrival there is enormous. Both the anticipation built by the centuries of poetry written about the bay, and the anticipation built within the text itself by the journey northward that has been heading in this direction. The bay is scattered with hundreds of small pine-covered islands in an extraordinary variety of configurations, some large and flat, some tiny vertical outcroppings, some linked to each other by narrow ridges of rock, some isolated, all of them covered with pine trees that have been shaped by the sea wind into forms of great beauty and singularity. The light on the water changes through the day. The mist that often lies on the bay in the morning gives it a quality that the Japanese aesthetic tradition associates with ink painting, with the suggestive rather than the fully rendered. And Basho cannot write. The prose passage at Matsushima describes the beauty with care and precision. The haiku that follows is Sora's modest, competent, not remarkable. Basho's response to Matsushima is silence, and the silence is the most significant formal event in the text after the summer grass haiku at Hiraizumi. The silence means there is beauty that the haiku form, which works by selecting a single image and concentrating all meaning into it, cannot adequately meet. Matsushima is too various, too abundant, too simultaneously complex to yield to the compression that haiku requires. Any single image selected from it would reduce it. The form that would do it justice would need to be as multivalent and as long as the landscape itself, which means no literary form can do it justice. The silence is the admission and the complement. Matsushima exceeds language, and Basho, who has made a practice of finding the language for what seems to exceed it, acknowledges the limit. But the silence is also an argument. If the highest beauty is the beauty that cannot be captured, that exceeds every instrument available to human consciousness for preserving what it encounters, then the highest beauty is also the most purely impermanent, the thing that exists fully only in the moment of being experienced, that leaves no adequate trace, that the memory retains only as a general quality of having been overwhelmed rather than as a set of specific retrievable images. Matsushima, in its silence, is the purest expression of mano no aware in the text. Beauty so complete that even the haiku, which exists to preserve beauty, falls short. What remains after leaving Matsushima is not a poem, but the knowledge that you were there, which is the same thing that remains after any experience of sufficient intensity. Not the experience, but the knowledge of having had it, the trace of a fullness that cannot be reconstructed from its trace. The pilgrimage dimension of the journey works in productive tension with the natural one. The concept of utamakura, the poetically famous sites of Japan, means that the landscapes Basho moves through are not simply natural places, but natural places that have been saturated with literary meaning through centuries of poetic engagement. The river at Natori, the barrier gate at Shirakawa, the bay at Matsushima, all of these are natural features of the Northeast that also carry within them the accumulated weight of every poem that has been written about them, every consciousness that has stood at them and tried to find the language for what the standing felt like. When Basho arrives at these sites, he is arriving at a palimpsest, a natural fact layered over with literary meaning, a landscape, and a library simultaneously. This dual nature of the utamakura makes visiting them an act that is simultaneously natural and literary, physical and intertextual. Standing at Shirakawa, the famous barrier gate that marked the boundary between the relatively settled southern provinces and the deeper north, Basho is aware of every poet who has stood at the same boundary before him and felt the same combination of anticipation and something like apprehension. He is in conversation with Noin, who wrote about Shirakawa in the 11th century. He is in conversation with Seijio, who passed through it in the 12th. He is the latest in a series of consciousness that have encountered this particular threshold, and his haiku is his contribution to the ongoing conversation that the threshold has been generating for hundreds of years. Poetry in this tradition is not individual expression so much as collective transmission, each poem participating in a conversation larger than any single poet, each consciousness adding its perception to an accumulating record of what this particular place has meant to the human beings who have moved through it across time. This understanding of the poetic pilgrimage as collective transmission has a specific relationship to memory and to the possibility of persistence. The natural landscape will persist, the mountains, the bay, the stone of the mountain temple, without any human help, without any act of preservation or documentation. The human experiences that took place within the natural landscape will not persist unless someone preserves them. The specific quality of what Seijio felt at Shirakawa, the specific grief of Yoshitsune's final journey through these mountains, the specific beauty of the Fujiwara civilization before it was destroyed. Poetry is the instrument of this preservation, and the haiku is the most concentrated and durable form of the instrument. It preserves not the fact of the experience, but its essential quality, distilled to an image that can travel through time without losing what it is holding. The summer grass haiku will be legible as long as Japanese is legible, which means it will outlast every other artifact of the culture that produced it, except the language itself. The transience of civilization is the theme that crystallizes when the natural and the poetic pilgrimage themes meet the historical one, and Hiraizumi is where the crystallization happens. The Fujiwara built their civilization in the mountains of the Northeast with the intention, implicit in every act of construction, of producing something that would last. The Golden Hall of the Chusanji, still standing, protected now by an outer structure built in the Edo period specifically to preserve it, contains the lacquered and gilded coffins of the Fujiwara lords, their bodies preserved within an architecture of gold and mother of pearl that announced the conviction of permanence with every gilded surface. The Fujiwara were not simply wealthy people spending money on decoration. They were making a claim about their civilization's relationship to time. This will still be here. 5 centuries after the Fujiwara's destruction, it is still partly here. The Golden Hall survives. The outer temple complex retains some of its original character. But the palaces are gone. The gardens have been absorbed by the landscape. The fields where the Fujiwara's armies trained and the Fujiwara's court gathered are growing summer grass, indifferent to their history, indifferent to the claims that were made in the architecture they have replaced. The contrast between the surviving Golden Hall, the deliberate act of preservation, and the grass-covered fields where everything else once stood is the physical expression of the text's central argument. You can preserve a few things with great effort and continued intention, but the world takes everything else, and the world is patient and thorough and has no preference for what it takes. The Du-Fu parallel that Basho invokes explicitly at Hiraizumi, quoting the Chinese poet directly in the prose before the haiku, an unusual move in a text that is generally economical with its literary references, is the move that transforms the local Japanese story into a universal human one. Du-Fu watched an empire fall. He watched the courts that had patronized poets and produced centuries of cultural achievement dissolve into factional violence and military catastrophe. He wrote from inside this collapse with a quality of witness that refused to look away from the cost of human ambition, while also refusing to pretend that the beauty of what was being lost canceled the reality of the beauty. His poems about the ruined Tang capital, the flowers still blooming, the birds still singing, the spring still arriving while the civilization fell apart, are the model for Basho's haiku about summer grass at Hiraizumi. Both poets are asking the same question in different historical landscapes. What does it mean that beauty persists and civilizations end? That the mountain temple survives the dynasty that built it? That the grass grows over the palace with the same patience it applies to everything else? The answer that both poets arrive at, through their different forms and their different historical moments, is not a consolation and not a despair. The world is what it is, and human civilization is a temporary condition of a world that was here before it and will be here after. And the appropriate response to this is not to refuse to build or to love or to create. The Fujiwara were not wrong to build their golden civilization, and Basho is not wrong to write haiku that he knows will eventually be forgotten, but to build and love and create with full awareness of the temporariness, which is the same as building and loving and creating with full attention. The grass haiku is not a pessimistic statement. It is a statement of reality, and the reality it states contains within it everything the text has been working toward. The beauty of the world and its indifference to human desire, the permanence of the natural and the transience of the constructed, the patience of time and the urgency of the single moment that the haiku crystallizes before releasing. The text stops, not ends, stops with Basho preparing to set out again. Friends welcome him at Agaki. There is a brief rest. There is the warmth of reunion. And then the road calls again, and the text lets him go into the uncertainty of the next journey without following. The stopping is the most honest possible formal choice for a text whose argument is that the journey has no terminus. That home is the movement itself, that the world continues beyond every frame and every form and every attempt to conclude it. The mountains were there before Japan existed. They are still there. They will be there after Basho, after the shogunate, after the poetic tradition he embodied and transformed, after the readers who read this text in all the centuries since it was written and all the centuries still to come. The text acknowledges this by declining to conclude, by releasing its reader into the same continuing world that it has been describing, by making of the stopping itself one final, wordless haiku. There is a final dimension to the nature theme worth dwelling on before the text releases us. The question of what the natural world actually is in the text, as opposed to what it represents. It is tempting, and in some ways natural, to read the mountains and the sea and the cicadas and the summer grass as symbols, to read the grass as standing for impermanence, the mountains for permanence, the cicadas for the brief but intense beauty of mortal life. And the text does produce these meanings, does allow the natural images to carry philosophical weight. But the primary mode of the natural in Oku, no Hosomichi, is not symbolic. It is literal. The grass is grass. The cicadas are cicadas. The mountain is a mountain. The weight they carry in the text is not added to them by Basho's interpretive intelligence. It is found in them, discovered through the quality of attention that the practice of haiku requires and that the journey itself imposes. The natural world in this text is not a code to be deciphered. It is a reality to be met. This matters because it changes what kind of response the text asks for. If nature were symbolic in the text, the correct response to a haiku would be interpretation. What does this image stand for? What is Basho communicating through it? What is the coded message? But if nature is literal, if the cicada is a cicada and not a symbol of brevity, if the summer grass is summer grass and not a symbol of impermanence, then the correct response to the haiku is attention. To actually hear the cicada, to actually see the grass, to let the specificity of the image produce its effect without rushing to convert the effect into meaning. The text is not asking you to think. It is asking you to perceive. And the perceiving, if you let it happen, produces the thinking, produces no-aware, produces the awareness of impermanence, produces the quality of being in the world that Basho has spent 5 months and 2,400 kilometers of road practicing. The haiku is the most concentrated form of an invitation to this practice, and accepting the invitation is what reading Oku no Hosomichi, really reading it, requires. The beauty and the sadness and the clarity that the text produces are not separate. Then the clarity, the recognition that the passing is not something happening to the beauty, but something the beauty is made of. That impermanence is not the enemy of what is beautiful in the world, but its condition, its ground, the thing that makes the encounter with it an encounter rather than a permanent possession. And then the haiku ends, and you are somewhere else, and the next moment of the journey is already arriving. And the world continues its patient movement through time, and the mountains are still there. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.